Welcome to the Crypto and Blockchain Talk.
Hello.
Hey.
Guten Tag.
Aloha.
Hola.
Shalom.
Hallo.
Namaste.
Ni hao.
Privet.
Hello.
Salut.
Yassas.
Salve.
Ciao.
Bonjour. Our podcast talks about the latest trends in the worlds of cryptocurrencies and the blockchain.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of Crypto and Blockchain Talk. And today with me, I have Edan Yago, who is a contributor to the Sovereign Protocol. So let's, first of all, welcome him to the program. Hello, Edan. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Aviva. It's a pleasure to be on the call with you, and I look forward to it.
Oh, I got to tell you, I'm excited. Plus, I'm loving that South African accent.
It's one of my few good features.
I doubt it. I highly doubt it. Let's first start off with how you got into this space before we start talking about our main topic, which is really about what's happening with Bitcoin lately. So before we go any further, let's talk about you and how you got into this space, because I'm really interested. So how did you get into this whole thing with crypto?
Well, Aviva, my family had uncles who died in British concentration camps and others who had to fight their way out of ghettos, others who had to flee German forces. I myself have been shot at and been beaten during police interviews. And I know members of my family who have lost everything due to inflation, and friends who have had their family funds confiscated by banks and by governments. And I am a white person of middle class background. What that teaches me, what it has taught me over the course of my life, is that freedom is extremely precious, extremely fragile, and it can be lost to anyone. If it can be lost to me, it can be lost to anyone. And so I think because I grew up to a family that fought the South African apartheid government and paid a heavy price for it, and because I had to start smuggling gold out of South Africa when I was a young boy just to get money out of the country to my family who had fled, and because of the background from which I came and the stories in which I grew up and the other experiences that I and my friends have had over the course of our lives, I was extremely ready, primed for Bitcoin when I first heard about it. And so in 2011, when I first came across the Satoshi white paper, it blew my mind. I realized that this was game changer in terms of the ability for individuals, any individual, but in particular the weakest individuals, the most vulnerable individuals, to be able to protect their economic sovereignty, to be able to protect their economic freedom. And there is no freedom more important than your economic freedom, because that is how you sustain yourself. It is how you sustain your family. It is how you achieve your hopes and your dreams, right? As important as free speech is, free transactions, the ability to freely control your financial destiny is vastly more important. And yet it is one of the least protected freedoms, one of the ones that we lose fast and first, even here in the Western world. And it has very, very few protections. And so what got me excited and what has maintained my excitement in Bitcoin over the course of all of these years is I think it is the first real tool for individuals to be able to achieve their financial sovereignty, protect it, and to hold their destiny in their own hands.
Absolutely. I'm also quite taken with your story. That is a pretty heavy entryway and also a very meaningful one for someone to have in terms of an argument of why they consider freedoms, all freedoms, to be important, and definitely in terms of owning and being able to control your own finances and also grow your own finances. These are absolute rights. They are not privileges, for sure.
You know, Aviva, I think almost everyone agrees that freedoms are important.
Yeah.
But what I think and I fear often is that a lot of people forget how fragile freedoms are.
Mm-hmm.
And how people can be lulled into a sense of complacency. They can believe that the world will continue to be tomorrow as it was yesterday. And we are very lucky. A lot of us are very lucky that over the last 30 years, we've grown up and lived in a world of almost unprecedented freedoms and stability. But if there's one lesson that history, humanity's history in general, and my personal and family history has taught me is that those periods are punctuated with sudden turns. And we will never know what it is that's going to cause that turn. Maybe you think it's global warming. Maybe you think it's the rise of polarization politically and fascism. Maybe you think it's inflation. Maybe you think it's government debt. But the thing is, we have all of these things right now. And yet many people remain complacent. So from my perspective and my journey in Bitcoin, a lot of it has been a mission of trying to make Bitcoin as easy to use and as attractive to people as possible, so that even if they don't have a fundamental sense of why they need it, they end up using it or acquiring it, so that if things turn, it won't be too late for them and for their families and for the people they know.
Many freedoms, though, are linked inextricably to money, because if you don't have financial freedom, you eventually become someone's slave, correct? Many of our podcasts, they've been about scams and all the types of activities that happen in the financial spaces, crypto and otherwise, that can actually negatively impact people to the point where they have lost many freedom. They have lost everything because they've made poor investment choices or been involved with projects who have taken all of their savings, all of their funds, which has made them lose their home, which is obviously their shelter. We've spoken to people who've literally lost everything, and they would actually say that through bad investments, they've lost their freedom. You know, it's really interesting because your story is very intertwined. The freedoms and finances absolutely go hand in hand.
I totally agree, and I think you bring up such an important point. So I've been involved in Bitcoin since 2011, and over the course of that period, there's always been a new promise, a shiny new project, and I've often had friends or colleagues send me an email or call me up and say, well, what do you think about this? What do you think about Ripple? What do you think about Ethereum? What do you think about this ICO or that ICO? And throughout this period, I have always remained, I say I'm not in the crypto space, I'm in the Bitcoin space. Mm-hmm. And the reason I say that is because what drives me to this space is not a desire to get rich quick, which is almost always an illusion and almost always a calamity. What drives me here are the fundamental principles and values that I hold dear and that I think are best achieved through Bitcoin because it was created explicitly for the purpose of capturing new territories of freedom for individuals. And I have avoided all of these other projects because of this fundamental belief and a desire to look at the principles and the fundamentals of every single project. Now, today we're in this situation again, right? So in 2017, it was ICOs. Today, it's all of these DeFi, so-called DeFi projects.
Yep. And
you have projects on Ethereum. And I am concerned that already a lot of people have lost a lot of money and will continue to lose a lot of money. And for that reason, I think it's really important that we remind people that this is not simply just a new technology. It is not simply a matter of investing. Conservatism, weirdly enough, it's weird to say if you're involved in Bitcoin that you're taking a conservative approach, but in practice you are. I think it is a huge mistake to think that you've missed out on Bitcoin or that you need to get into the hot new thing, because that is how people end up losing a huge amount of money. And unless you are deeply, deeply familiar with the projects that you are involved in, and probably even not then, are you able to ascertain whether or not there's real value there. Mm-hmm. So just to take a step back, I don't think that there is a lot of value. I don't think there's very broad value in the crypto space. All right, people like to say you can use blockchain for this and you can use blockchain for that and you can use blockchain for whatever, right? You scrape your knee, you slather some blockchain on it and you feel better, right?
That is hysterical. Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
But in practice, this is not a revolution that is broad. It's a revolution that is narrow but deep. And what it fundamentally does is it creates a new monetary standard upon which we can build a new financial and economic standard, which is what Bitcoiners would call permissionless or uncensorable, which means that no one can take away your control of your funds. That's all it really means. And all of these other projects are effectively trying to live in this cloud of hype around this fundamental change, but miss the point. So I try to encourage people that if you are entering this world of financial sovereignty, the place to do it is Bitcoin. The place to stay is Bitcoin. And there may be, for specific reasons, other projects which you have utility in. But you probably shouldn't be engaging in them unless you yourself find real utility in them. Because otherwise you can't really know whether or not it's just hype or not. And I think that's, true of any investment and true of any purchase you make. If you yourself aren't finding utility in it, then you are purely a speculator. And it's very hard as a speculator to win. The cards are always stacked against you.
It's interesting because, Bitcoin and many other or all other cryptocurrencies, they still don't have the kind of understanding and foothold that people really need to have in order for this to gain the kind of traction it needs to gain in order for people to really understand that this kind of financial freedom is available to them. Like I said before, we talk to a lot of people, and we've been talking to a lot of people in universities. We've been doing some surveys. And it turns out, and this is, by the way, a very wide sampling across countries, and within those countries, equal mix of male and female. And still, in terms of understanding, we're at base zero, which is really interesting because during this time of COVID, it seems that this would be the time for people where they are losing their jobs, there's more lockdowns, depending on where in the world it is, and I don't want to keep rehashing this negative image of what's going on in the world. We all know what's happening out there, but if adoption was ever going to take place, it would be now, wouldn't it be?
Well, I think it is happening. I think Bitcoin grows in what in biology you would call a punctuated equilibrium. In other words, it doesn't look like a steady or normal growth curve. And the reason is that the growth curve of Bitcoin adoption is exponential, right? So it started off with basically no adoption, like no one was using it at all. And over the course of the last 10 years, it's grown to tens of millions of people. But the world is 7 billion people, and it will continue to grow until it is adopted effectively by everyone. But because it has a price, what happens again and again and again is that people dismiss it. And because they dismiss it while the adoption continues, and it goes from 10 million to 20 million, its price is massively undervalued. And then suddenly people start to realize this, and the price starts to rise, and then more people realize it, and then other people FOMO in, and the price rises dramatically until it surpasses where it should be. And then it drops suddenly, and then it continues to drop until it's below where it should be. And it does this again and again and again. And so you could draw a curve of the actual adoption of Bitcoin, and around it a squiggly line, which is above and beyond, constantly going above or below this line, which is the price of Bitcoin. So today we have tens of millions of people who are Bitcoin holders or Bitcoin users. It grows roughly 10x every 4 years. So 2 years from now, it will be hundreds of millions of people. And I suspect that we are now at a point which is again going to be an inflection, where we're going to, once again, we're almost right where we should be in terms of the price curve meeting the adoption curve. And I think it's now going to start rising above where it should be, and probably will continue to do that for another year or two, until its price has gone, to what would look from here to near infinity, and then probably it will crash again. And I suspect this will happen a few more times before the curve settles down, because the vast majority of people have already adopted Bitcoin.
It's absolutely true that Bitcoin has had really interesting gains. The hash rate has reached a new high. There's a lot more confidence. There's definitely high miner confidence in the prospects of Bitcoin. And of course, there are a number of reasons, I think, behind Bitcoin on the verge of maybe, I don't want to say escalating faster than normal, because I also need for everyone to know is that this is in no way financial advice. Do your own homework. You are definitely taking a risk when you are entering the crypto sphere. But, Bitcoin has had a strong performance in the last week for sure. And there's been a lot of positive news coming from many companies involved in purchasing Bitcoins. Stone Ridge, for instance, which is a multi-billion-dollar company, they purchased $115 million worth of Bitcoin. Square, as we've done a previous podcast on, just invested $50 million into Bitcoin, and they're talking about already making more purchases of that size. Of course, we have the Grayscale investment. There's over $5 billion US worth of Bitcoin that they've invested in. They're actually buying Bitcoin faster than it can be mined. And there's countless companies who are trying to replicate Grayscale, and they are also purchasing these amounts. There's many other people we don't know about, all these whales out there who are moving Bitcoin, and we can obviously see these movements and track them. And this is impacting the price, because when Square, of course, made their purchases, we saw Bitcoin jump around 2.5% within the next few hours of that purchase. When Grayscale did their purchase, we saw the same. So we can see that these movements happen when these massive companies buy up huge amounts. But what do you think that does in terms of the volatility of the cryptocurrency and just how much impact these companies will have on the price and its fluctuation? In other words, again, it's volatility.
I tend to think that the way you should think about Bitcoin is in long time scales. So because it's volatile, it doesn't matter really what its price was a week ago. What matters is where the trajectory is. And the trajectory over a long time scale throughout the entire history of Bitcoin has always been up. And I think right now, in particular, we're entering a phase where the momentum is going to be very strong, and it's going to rise probably quite dramatically over the next 18 months to 2 years. And I say that simply because this is the heartbeat of Bitcoin. It's almost like a regular heartbeat. If you can imagine the heartbeat on a hospital monitor, you see it go up and down, up and down, up and down in relatively regular intervals. And that is what happens with Bitcoin's price. Now, the volatility is dampening. And as large institutional players enter the market, and as more and more people are familiar with it, and as the body of holders increases, the volatility will get smaller. But it's not going to get particularly small anytime soon, because as we said earlier, there's only a few tens, maybe 100 million people in the world who have Bitcoin or some exposure to Bitcoin. And there's a 7 billion population. So until we have something closer to 500 million, a billion or 2 billion holders, the volatility will stay with us. Now, that's probably going to happen sooner than we expect, right? It's very likely, because Bitcoin grows fastest when its price is growing fastest, that we will see the leap from 100 million people to a billion people over the next few years. And the volatility will decrease. But I think that we are likely to continue to see volatility for quite some time. So I think, some people like volatility because they're day traders. I am not smart enough to be a day trader, and I think probably most people aren't. And so I prefer to think about things in longer time scales, where I can think of them in fundamental terms rather than, which company bought this or what the stock market is doing and how it's going to impact Bitcoin. And that has served me very well over the years.
It's funny that you actually would mention the stock market, because I was looking at an article earlier today which basically said even though the stock markets are performing not as healthily as they normally do, Bitcoin's price is doing the opposite. So as stocks are dropping, Bitcoin seems to be lifting. And it is something which institutions for sure take more notice of, something about cryptocurrencies in terms of using them as an investment vehicle. But how do you think that the average person who's looking for an investment then looks at Bitcoin? Because it's an investment, right, for many people. Many people don't look at Bitcoin as a method of payments. They just don't. When they're entering this space, we know this from research, many people are not getting into Bitcoin because they're going, you know what, I want to go buy that pizza today. I'm going to go and get some Bitcoin. They don't do that. They go, I want a new investment which I can afford. I'm going to buy a little bit of Bitcoin and maybe some other cryptocurrencies, right? So what do you think is happening when stocks are dropping? Why would somebody then look to Bitcoin and go, you know what, I'm going to dabble in this?
No, I think the best way to think about Bitcoin is not as a stock, but more as a house, right? So when people buy a house, they are thinking in two terms. First of all, they're thinking, I want something solid, something that's going to be reliable, something that is going to give me shelter. And that's what Bitcoin does. Bitcoin gives you shelter. It doesn't put a roof over your head, but it gives you financial shelter in the form of self-determination for your funds that you can take anywhere, anytime, and that no one can take away from you. The second thing is that when you're buying a house, you don't think, unless you're flipping houses, which is relatively rare, right? What most people do when they buy a house is they don't think, oh, I hope this house is going to be worth more in 2 weeks. They think, this is something which I hope to have in my old age. I hope to bequeath to my children. I hope that 10 years from now is going to, change my financial circumstances. And that, again, is what Bitcoin is. Bitcoin, if you hold it and think of it as real estate, and that essentially is what Bitcoin is. If you think about it, you can think of Bitcoin as a giant piece of real estate. And it's got 21 million plots, which we call coins. And there's never going to be any more plots, but there's always going to be demand for those plots. So if you buy a Bitcoin, you own 1/21 millionth of the entire plot of land, and it will continue to perform for you like real estate. Of course, unlike real estate, it grows much faster because it is also a new technology, and it's as if, we were all moving to the city, all 7 billion of us were going to move to the city over the next 10 years. Well, you'd be very lucky to have a plot of land there right now. So I think that's the better way to think about Bitcoin in terms of investment. And especially now that even with things like Sovereign, which is the project that I'm working on, you can start to earn yield on your Bitcoin on an ongoing basis. It becomes even more attractive and I think even more reasonable to think of it in those terms. How I suggest people think about this is if your freedom, your future security, your children's well-being in their futures is important to you, then I think Bitcoin is unlike any other asset class we're familiar with, and it should absolutely be something that you care about as something that you own and control.
I just want to put something into context here and then get a comment from you about this. So it's beautifully stated the way that you just said, okay, you want to compare this to real estate where literally it's an island with 21 million plots and you're owning one of those plots if you own a Bitcoin. And we obviously have other commodities out there which perhaps aren't as volatile. Yes, I understand what you're saying about the more adoption there is and the more growth, the less volatility, inversely proportional, all of this. But like gold, for instance, is up again, and I think it's over $1,900 an ounce right now. Silver also is having a similar performance. I think it's almost $25 per ounce. So what would you say to someone looking at Bitcoin as an asset and the store value within it? What would you say in terms of Bitcoin also showing that it's performing very strong alongside gold and silver, as stocks are doing the inverse to that?
I would say gold has nothing on Bitcoin. It is a pale comparison to Bitcoin, and I'll explain why. So earlier on I mentioned that, I needed to smuggle funds out of South Africa to get them to my family. My family owned Kruger rands, which was a type of gold coin which was minted by the South African government. And it was worth a lot. It was worth more than its weight in gold because it was so rare. And when my family were forced to flee South Africa, what my mother did is she took Kruger rands and sewed them into a coat. And I was a young boy of between 9 and 11. And I would repeatedly fly alone, because they wouldn't search children, out of South Africa, out of Jan Smuts Airport, and then get the gold coins to my family. Now, this was extremely perilous. It was extremely difficult, something that they had to get the young boy to do because anyone else would get caught. And even then, you can imagine that everyone in the family was extremely nervous about it. But with Bitcoin, I set up my computer and I send it across the world and I'm done. It takes, 2 minutes. Now, this isn't important just to people who are trying to flee from somewhere. It's important to businesses that want to be able to settle large accounts. It's important to people who are performing remittance payments back to their families at home. It's important to financial institutions that want to trade. Already, Bitcoin is vastly more liquid on the exchanges than gold. It trades 24/7 and it trades itself, not paper representations or digital representations of gold, which is locked away at vaults and maybe you can't get access to. And time and time again, even governments have lost access to their Bitcoin. Recently, the UK refused to return Venezuela's gold to Venezuela, and the US refused to return France's gold to France. So if even sovereign states can't be sovereign through gold, what chance do corporations or individuals have? And in that respect, Bitcoin is vastly superior to gold. And at the same time, it is also more rare, and there is less awareness of it still. And so I think you think about those things and it becomes immediately apparent that Bitcoin is massively undervalued versus gold. But then when you also think that we have an entire new generation of millennials and Gen Z who are coming into their own financially, they're going to be inheriting great wealth from their parents and grandparents. They're starting to make real money in their jobs. And you ask yourself, this generation, what are they going to prefer? This generation that has grown up with a phone in their hand and a laptop or an iPad everywhere they go, are they going to be enamored with this dead metal, or are they going to be looking for something which is as digital as the rest of their lives? And so I think gold has indeed played an important role and provided monetary and fiscal discipline for governments for hundreds of years. But ultimately, governments decided to get rid of it. They unpegged the dollar to gold and they confiscated people's gold. And even in the United States, in the country most free in the world, they confiscated people's gold. You can't do that with Bitcoin. So it's time now for a new monetary standard. And how lucky we are that one was created by Satoshi Nakamoto, that genius inventor who created something that the world needed and then disappeared out of humility. We are extremely lucky as a species that every time we need something, we tend to, at the very last minute, discover or invent it. And that exactly is what Bitcoin represents. It's the new paradigm. I could not be more convinced of that. And I think that gold, while it is fun and luxurious, can't hold a candle to Bitcoin.
I think that was beautifully put in terms of Bitcoin versus gold and silver. Let's now talk about the Sovereign protocol. Now, I'm on the Sovereign website, which is Sovereign, SOVRYN.app, and it says your keys, your control. What differentiates this platform from others?
To me, it has always seemed very strange that we would go to the effort of inventing and acquiring for ourselves a asset which was uncensorable, permissionless, where you don't need anyone's permission to hold it, to move it, to do with it as you please. I have an app on my phone called Revolut. It's like a bank app. And I, a few days ago, transferred money to that app, right? It's a bank. It's regulated. It holds billions of dollars of people's funds for millions of people. And people love it, right? So I transferred funds. They thought that the amount that I transferred was too large and therefore suspicious. And therefore, they shut down my access to the account and I can't make any transfers. And I'm stuck in that situation until they decide that, yes, the copious amounts of documentation that they're requiring me to provide are satisfying to them. And then they will do me the favor of allowing me access to my own funds again. To me, that's absurd. And it's far more absurd when people would allow themselves to be placed in that position with a type of currency where the entire point of it is that you should remain in control of your funds. You should remain financially sovereign. Now, there are all of these centralized exchanges, right? There are all of these services where they're basically like Bitcoin banks, and you can trade and you can exchange, and they will let you hold your Bitcoin with them. But every now and again, one of them is hacked, and every now and again, the regulators decide that they don't like one. Just recently, one of the biggest, BitMEX, which held billions and billions worth of Bitcoin, was sued by multiple different federal agencies from the US. Mm-hmm. And people can lose all of their financial privacy and potentially their funds at any time due to the whim of the person who controls the exchange. It happened a few days later to another one of the largest exchanges in the world, OKX. They decided that they're not going to be processing any more withdrawals for any of their customers until further notice, which nobody knows when that is. And it gets worse than that. On April 5th, 1933, in the United States, Executive Order 6102 was signed, which announced that all private citizens' gold was going to be confiscated by the federal government. Now, this could happen tomorrow with regards to Bitcoin. And they can confiscate those funds, and they don't even need to because these exchanges will do it themselves, as OKX have shown us over the course of the last week, at any time and without warning. So I've always been extremely uncomfortable using these services. And out of frustration, myself and several other people have started to build and have now launched a alternative which allows you to lend your Bitcoin, to earn yield on your Bitcoin, to borrow Bitcoin, to trade against other cryptocurrencies or other types of assets without ever having to give up custody or give up your financial privacy, because the system is almost as decentralized as Bitcoin itself. I think that's going to be the next stage in the evolution of the Bitcoin story. Bitcoin was a monetary revolution. It's revolutionized money. And now the next stage is a financial revolution, which is revolutionizing the finances and the financial services around Bitcoin. And the final stage is going to be an economic revolution. And that's really when the payments aspect will come into its own. And when we're done with all three of those phases, we will all have more control over our funds than has ever existed in the history of humankind. And so we are trying to, with Sovereign, contribute what we can to making that a reality.
What exactly then are the benefits of being with the Sovereign protocol as opposed to others?
So I think the easiest way to think about Sovereign is you can think of it almost like an alternative to Revolut. So in Revolut, I can hold funds and I can buy Bitcoin and I can sell Bitcoin, but I actually never own that Bitcoin. I never control it, right? I never hold the Bitcoin. I just hold what they tell me is my Bitcoin balance. With Sovereign, instead of going to a centralized service or an exchange, or instead of going to, so instead of using Bitstamp or Kraken, instead of using OKX, instead of using Celsius or Nexo, or where you would go and you would fill out a form and provide them with pictures of your passport and pictures of yourself. And to withdraw, sometimes you'll discover that they'll require additional information from you, and sometimes it will take you a long time, or maybe you won't even be able to provide this information. And very often you won't know what it is before you try to withdraw, because they're much happier. They make it much easier to deposit the funds than to withdraw the funds, right?
Right.
Instead of doing all of those things and then taking your Bitcoin and giving it to them and hoping that they will be good custodians of your funds, we allow you to do everything that you would do with them, but we never act as a custodian. And because the system is decentralized, we also never ask you for any identifiable information whatsoever. And when I say we, I mean the protocol itself. So we actually don't control the protocol. We build it in the same way that people built Bitcoin, and we can work and will continue to work to improve it. But it actually isn't controlled by any set of individuals. It is a protocol which the trust in it is not based on you trusting somebody else because you know them or because they're regulated, but because the system itself is written and its rules are written into the very code which runs it.
I love the fact that it's a decentralized trading and lending platform because, as you're well aware, many products out there are centralized, which, as we said, I think at the beginning of this podcast, completely defeats the purpose.
That's right, yes. Now, there are other attempts to build something like this. The most well-known or popular today are built on a protocol called Ethereum. And I think many of those projects have done amazing things. Compound is a lending platform, which is in many ways similar. MakerDAO is a way for people to issue dollars on the basis of their collateral, their cryptocurrency collateral. And I think all of those have been magnificent attempts and have really driven forward the state of the art when it comes to building decentralized financial services, which is what DeFi means, right? This decentralized finance.
Yep.
The issue with all of those, however, is that they run on the Ethereum system, which means that it's very awkward to use Bitcoin with them. You can't just have Bitcoin. You also need to have other tokens. In particular, you need to have Ethereum, which means that now you have far more complexity, and you also need to invest in this additional token, which I don't think has the fundamental values or properties of Bitcoin. And it is extremely expensive to use because the system is not able to scale to meet the demand, in part because it isn't designed like Bitcoin. So we, with Sovereign, have been contributing to an effort to build a system which is Bitcoin native, in which you only need to have Bitcoin if you choose to, where you don't need to have any other tokens to pay the fees, where it is extremely easy to use because it's part of the Bitcoin ecosystem, and where you know that because you're part of the Bitcoin ecosystem, the system itself is built on some of the same security assurances that Bitcoin itself provides. So we've built Sovereign on a Bitcoin side chain, which means it's a different blockchain, which is like a child chain of Bitcoin. It's security protected right now by 40% of the hash power or the security behind Bitcoin, and that is growing. And as a result, it is the most secure chain in the world, with the exception of Bitcoin main chain itself. And so you gain the advantages of increased simplicity, reduced fees, faster processing, and the ability to remain part of the most important, most liquid, most secure monetary system in the world, which is Bitcoin.
How else are people finding out about Sovereign and entering into this space? Because I see by the website that you are in a testing period, it looks like.
That's right, yes. It's now live, but we've limited the transaction sizes on Sovereign Protocol right now to $21 maximum, because we take security extremely seriously. So the system has been audited by multiple different third-party auditors. We have huge numbers relatively of the community testing the system every day. We have developers who are just part of the open source community reviewing our code, but we are extremely security conscious, and we want to make sure that the limitations are removed, and this should happen in a few weeks, that everything will be secure and that people will not lose their funds. Sovereign is proving to be a very charismatic project. People, when they hear about it, they realize that, of course, it's like, there's a head-slapping moment. Like, how does this not yet exist, right? It's just so obvious. Why would you not want? It's so absurd that you would take your Bitcoin, this decentralized currency, and place it into a service where you're now subject to their discretion. The fact that people now have an alternative, when people hear about this, they become very excited. And so we now have, despite the fact that we only started talking about the fact that Sovereign was a thing a few weeks ago, we've got hundreds of people who are excited about it and are testing it out and are telling their friends about it and are tweeting about it. And we have podcasts like yours, Aviva, inviting us to come speak about it. And it's been really very gratifying, for me on a personal level, to see something that I've been working on and care very much about also resonating with so many other people.
I think it's lovely that you have so many people testing it. I'm right now on your testnet, and it looks pretty interesting. And of course, for everyone who's listening, all of the listeners out there in crypto and blockchain talk land, when you go to the Sovereign website, you'll see it says Enter Testnet at the very top of the navigation bar on the very right. So all I can say at this point is I wish you the very best of luck with this project. It really looks amazing.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Well, I invite all of your listeners to try it out. Well, I would say this. If they haven't yet taken the leap into Bitcoin, I'd ask them, what are they waiting for? And I don't think that necessarily sovereign is the first thing you should use. I think first you should get a little bit comfortable with Bitcoin. But once you're a little bit comfortable with Bitcoin, and if you're interested in trading, or if you're interested in earning yield, or if you think Bitcoin's going to do very well and you want to go long Bitcoin, you want to lever up your Bitcoin with more Bitcoin, then I think sovereign is, for me personally, and I think objectively, simply the best place, the best protocol in the world in which to do that.
You said that if you're very new into Bitcoin, which we have a lot of newbies who do listen to this podcast, what is the best way, and be explicit about this, for someone, in your opinion, to dip their toe in the water?
If you think about it, I think there's almost like a ladder of sovereignty, of personal sovereignty that people can climb, right? In stage 0, you maybe haven't heard about Bitcoin, or you've heard about it and you dismiss it. And then stage 1, you start doing a little bit of research. You start going a little bit down the rabbit hole. And now you're already more free because you've educated yourself. And information and education is power. And then the next step that most people take is they'll go to something like Coinbase, or one of these centralized services, and they'll buy themselves some Bitcoin, but they'll keep it on the exchange. So you're one step ahead of the people who are just doing research, but you still aren't realizing the full benefits. So the next stage is you now set up your wallet, and maybe you do some research around how to do that. You set up your own wallet, and now you're holding the Bitcoin yourself. And ideally, you know enough that you go and you set up maybe a multi-sig wallet, or you set yourself up with a hardware wallet. So you've taken a few steps. You've familiarized yourself with what it means to be self-sovereign, to be able to control your own funds and not to have to rely on someone else. And if you've done all of those things, then I think you're ready for sovereign.
I want to thank you so much for coming on to Crypto and Blockchain Talk. I really do wish you and your projects, no matter what you're working on, the very best of luck.
Thank you very much, Aviva. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, for me too. Well, I'd like to just remind everyone, in a little bit of a disclaimer, that we are basically giving you information and all the tools you need to become self-educating. Your investments are your responsibility. On top of that, we are not offering any investment advice, and nothing in our podcast should be construed as investment advice, because we wholeheartedly, really strongly recommend that you do your own research, your own due diligence. But on that note, we want to thank you so much for tuning into this week's Crypto and Blockchain Talk. Please do not forget to tell your friends and family all about our wonderful podcast series, which is available on a multitude of podcasting platforms, from iTunes, Podbean, Stitcher, Spotify, SoundCloud, all the way to Amazon Music, Apple, everything else you can think of. And the full list is on cryptoandblockchaintalk.com. Also, please do not forget that we also stream these interviews on our sister radio station, which is crypto24radio.com. That's crypto24radio.com. We love to hear from you. Honestly, we do. And don't stop those emails coming. So if you really want to get in touch with us, please email us at education@savvydigital. That's education@savvy, S-A-V-I-I digital.com. On top of that, we thank you again for listening to this week's podcast. We know how valuable your time is, and when you give time to us, we appreciate it more than you will ever know. So please take care, be safe, and goodbye.